Probably the most important upgrade to our teaching staff has been the addition of Dr. Rob Neal, who moved to Doral in 2003. Dr. Neal runs the biomechanics lab for all of our golf schools. Dr. Neal is the leading golf biomechanics expert in the world, having spent 22 years in biomechanics research in Australia before moving to Doral. Rob and I have worked hard together on improving the way we analyze golf swings. We now have literally thousands of players at every level in our system, and it's easy to see the differences from the poor ball strikers to the top ball strikers with Dr. Neal's newest software. The most serious golfer will love going through the biomechanics.
Welcome to the Jim McLean Golf Lesson. I'm Dr. Rob Neal from Golf BioDynamics, and today we're going to show you some really neat technology that we use to assist the instructors here at Doral in bringing about movement change and measuring what people do in their golf swing. I'd like to introduce you also to Mr. Steve Keogh, who's come over from Australia to work with us here at Doral and learn about this technology. You've heard about Jim's X Factor and X Factor stretch. Today we're going to show you how we actually measure that. We've already done a calibration on Steve, so we have these sensors that are placed on his body that measure very precisely how much his shoulders turn and his hips turn during the swing. In fact, Steve, if you could set up to the golf ball here and go to the top of your backswing, we've got his shoulder turn measured here right now at 80 degrees, and his hip turn is 43 degrees. So his X factor would be 43 degrees right at this moment. Thanks, Steve. You can relax for one moment. We know from measuring hundreds, and I mean literally hundreds of tour pros, what we should expect for a high-level golfer in terms of the X factor. And the range should be around 40 to 50 degrees. And this occurs dynamically. So Steve, when he was doing that statically, will always show a smaller X factor than when he does it during his swing. If we ask him to make a swing, which we'll do later, we'll see that this number will rise probably by about 7 or 8 degrees. So again, it's the difference between the hip and shoulder turns that we're measuring in three-dimensional space. So the question is, well, that's great. You know, we can measure that. How does that help the instructor? Well, it finds out for that instructor whether this person has got a limitation in terms of flexibility or perhaps even stability. Because if you can't hold your pelvis still, or at least reasonably stable as you turn your shoulders, you can't ever generate an X factor. So if your hips just turn and your shoulders turn, no X factor is generated. And the research evidence is clear that if you make a 40 to 50 degree X factor at the top of the backswing, that correlates quite highly with driving distance. But there are some other parts to it as well. So Jim in the early 90s talked about the X factor, and then in about 2000 we started discovering the second part of it, which is the X factor stretch. And I'm going to show you what this move looks like. And I think that in previous shows Jim's talked about a little kind of sit-down move at the top of the backswing, and then the hips lead out so that the hips bump to the left and then begin the downswing move. That's actually a move that increases the X factor, but we call that the X factor stretch. And this one is really, really crucial. Most amateur players that we measure have an X factor stretch of about 2 or 3 degrees. The tour average is 17 degrees. And there are some players, for example, Angel Cabrera, who hits the ball prodigious distances, his X factor stretch is about 25 degrees. And we'll see someone like J.B. Holmes, who again is one of these guys who hits the golf ball a long way. His X factor stretch is about 20 degrees. So you should get the picture that it's not just the X factor, but the X factor stretch that adds to the power that you develop during the downswing. Steve, I'd like you to just show us now, maybe just in front of the camera here, that move from the top of the backswing. So go to the top, and then the shoulders stay back as the hips begin to move, and then rotate. That's the X factor stretch, and it's crucial. So we might actually get Steve to hit a couple of shots here and measure what's going on, and we can say, well, what's his X factor? What's his X factor stretch? So I'll step back out of the view here so that Steve can have a swing, and we're going to be measuring this real time and bring the swing up on the monitor. I'm going to have the swing replayed right now, and we'll go through some of the key numbers. So if we go to the top of the backswing, his X factor at this point, if we can slide the screen down, is 47 degrees. So when he did it statically, just practicing the move, his X factor was 43. And I said it would increase dynamically, and it increased by about 4 degrees. So his X factor at the top is 47 degrees. If we now find out how much that increases by as we go through the beginning of the downswing, we're just looking to see how large that number becomes. And the maximum value that Steve reaches, and he's a pretty good athlete, by the way, gets it up to 70 degrees. So his X factor stretch is from 47 to 70 degrees. Now, if I'm doing the maths correctly, that's 23 degrees. So 23 degrees is putting him in the ballpark with some of the best ball strikers in the world. And I know from experience that even though Steve's a little guy at about 5'9", 155 pounds, he hits it well over 300 yards. And so part of that equation is that X factor stretch. I'd also like to talk to you a little bit more later on about a third component of this X factor, and we call it the rate of stretch and the rate of recoil. And last year in San Diego, I presented some research work that we'd done on looking at the longest hitters on the PGA Tour versus the shorter hitters on the PGA Tour, and seeing what the differences were. So there were some differences in X factor and X factor stretch, but the real big differences came in the rate of stretch and the rate of recoil. And so if we can cut to a close-up of the screen here, we'll have a look at one of the graphs that describe this rate of stretch and rate of recoil, and I'll go through the key points on it. And this value here at around 250 degrees per second is really, really high. So you can tell Steve's a good golfer that way. During the next part of the movement, the rate of recoil, so how rapidly does the shoulders catch up to the hips? And that's what we call the rate of recoil. So the peak value here is about 770 degrees. Now I've measured some really powerful guys, some long drive champions. Their rate of recoil is around 16 or 1700 degrees per second. So Steve's got a bit of work to do there. So he's got a great rate of stretch, but he's not strong and powerful enough to get a really high rate of recoil. And that's one of the things that really distinguishes between the very longest ball strikers and the guys who still hit it a long way. So all that information is great, but it really comes down to what do you do with this stuff? And so what I'd like to do now is go through a series of drills that we would use typically, and maybe even the instructor would be there with us, working on improving the transition sequence, which is all about improving your X factor stretch. Unfortunately, if there's a limitation in the X factor, that's probably a stability or more likely a flexibility issue, and that would take time to correct. So our usual protocol there would be to prescribe stretching exercises. We'd show people how to do these properly, and then hopefully in time have them improve their flexibility so that they can make the move that we want them to. But let's get Steve to do a couple of drills here. So